when you talk about outsmarting climate change, it's hilarious to me that the smartest solution is the simplest one that we keep returning to. And what outsmarting climate change really means is, how can we burden regular people more by avoiding, through our own cowardice and inability to actually stand up to powerful people, targeting the companies, the production of oil and of what's causing the worst of climate change.
Yeah, when I was writing this book, I came up with a little pithy slogan that we should not tax molecules, we should tax the rich, which it's insane, because the idea of a carbon tax, carbon is this neutral stuff that working class people use, you and I use, rich people use, and this idea that it's causing climate change, we're going to tax this neutral stuff. It can easily be turned into something that's going to be a tax on everyone, right? And no one likes that. So, traditionally, when the left was powerful, the main way the left got stuff done is through mass redistribution of wealth, and that's through taxing the rich. And so we need a massive and taxing of the rich. And by the way, over the last 40 years, nothing but tax cuts for the rich, from Reagan through through Trump, like that's just what they've been doing. And so we could, and that even, if we don't even want to, obviously I'm all on board for nationalizing the energy sector. I think that's something ultimately we have to do. But if we could just make our tax regime way more progressive and generate a huge amount of revenue to actually invest in remaking our energy system and remaking our infrastructure, like that kind of big, let's say like New Deal style sort of public goods, public investment regime. And in the New Deal, they tax the rich at these incredible levels too. That's what we need. And focusing on the molecules sort of distracts us from this class struggle that we're facing, and what we need to do to solve it.
It is. I'm hoping we can flesh out the class struggle element even more, because as you mentioned, and we talked about, the people dominating discourse are the professional managerial types, etc. Poor people are essentially left out of climate debate, and not just poor people within the United States, but the global South is largely ignored, and the global South is going to bear the brunt of how of climate change as it continues to wreak havoc on the planet. Can you talk about that dynamic, and particularly how global capitalism has made nations in the global South vulnerable, and how at the same time they're also given zero voice, for the most part, in the international climate debate?
Yeah, well, I would actually tweak that a little, because I think when you go into these PMC climate, they often call them like climate justice spaces, and actually they are very keen on they would say centering the frontline communities that are going to bear the worst consequences of climate change. And the whole conception of climate justice is that these poor, marginalized communities like indigenous peoples and peasant communities who are really trying to subsist from the land and from nature directly, and are seeing droughts and floods and horrific consequences right directly. And I think that's super important, in this climate justice framing is really powerful morally. But what that framing leaves out is that it focuses so on this kind of very small marginalized populations that it leaves out the greater mass of the working class, as I would say, in a capitalist society, because most of us don't actually rely on the land for our subsistence, and most of us are just trying to survive in the market by gaining a wage or an income, and so this kind of constant focus on these frontline communities and marginalized communities ultimately is creating this somewhat minoritarian politics that doesn't quite doesn't really speak to the greater masses of the working class. So what I argue is that to actually build the kind of power to deliver for those poor marginalized groups that are really suffering under, sometimes directly by fossil capital, like extraction and refineries and all these horrific projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline going through Standing Rock and all these things. To win on those struggles, we actually need to defeat, the same people, oil companies, big capital. We need to build the power to defeat them. And to do that, you actually need to appeal not just to the morality of these disenfranchised, marginalized groups, but you need to appeal to the broader mass of the working class. So what I argue, and it wasn't just me, it's like I think that the genius of the idea of a Green New Deal was that it was going to be a climate program that basically centered just these sort of material gains for everyday working people in a highly unequal capitalist system. So things like a job guarantee, Medicare for all, things like instead of a carbon tax, how about cheaper or even free electricity as a human right? Like these kinds of public goods delivering material gains to the broader masses of working class people could be a way to actually build the power. And then ultimately, I think when you bring up this global South issue, it's really important to realize that in terms of global emissions, historically, the United States is by far the greatest emitter. It's by far the worst, violator of international. It's always the agent in these international treaty negotiations, whether it be Copenhagen or Kyoto or wherever it was last year. I'm blanking, but it's the United States.
Scotland, right?
I think
Glasgow.
So. Glasgow. Yeah, Glasgow. United States is always sort of the one messing everything up. And the worst case of that was Obama in 2009. He just threw a hand grenade at the whole system and it fell apart. So the U.S. has been the biggest barrier to international climate cooperation and climate action. So if we could build a kind of Green New Deal type politics in the U.S., it wouldn't just have to be about decarbonizing the U.S. It'd have to be about transferring these green technologies to the world. And, it's kind of similar to this vaccine issue, allowing this technology to really be expanded to the entire world so that the whole world can deal with this global issue instead of just the wealthier parts of the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, if Biden's not going to waive vaccine intellectual property protections, I doubt he'll do it for electric vehicles or solar or whatever. I mean, the United States is behind, frankly, in terms of capitalist terms on the production of those because of the strength of the Republican Party in this country. So they're going to try to milk that once that's more widely proliferated for everything that it's worth. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of how deindustrialization in the United States has influenced this debate, because largely for decades the United States has been a service economy for the most part. Mm-hmm. Industrial production has been outsourced to other nations, poorer nations, and we're bearing the brunt of that during COVID in terms of the global supply chain being so complex that's been disrupted, and the United States does not have the capability or redundancy here domestically to reckon with it. But I also think it influences the politics around climate change that in a way that it is not influenced, or it's more unique here than it is in other nations. Do you agree with that sentiment? And how so, if so?
Yeah, it's a big issue because ultimately climate change is about our industrial production system. It's the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago was about essentially using coal, a fossil fuel, to power these mechanical machines like steam engines and eventually locomotives. And that kind of big industrial breakthrough was rooted in fossil fuels. And that's we're still stuck with this problem where we use fossil fuels to power these really incredible machines that are rooted back in the Industrial Revolution. But as you were hinting, essentially what's happened is the United States and many other rich countries went through this Industrial Revolution, and the working class got quite organized and built up incredible power through unions and political parties to actually build a political regime that benefited those workers to some degree. And this kind of reached its heyday in the post World War II era of, this sort of Fordist, high unionized regime where capitalism for a short 25 years was actually like sort of redistributing wealth in a somewhat egalitarian way. But of course, as you suggested, what happened was capital got, their profitability started to suffer, and they decided, well, we don't want to deal with these unions and this redistributive states anymore, so we're going to offshore capital around the world, or we're going to automate away these jobs to get rid of these pesky unionized workers. And that kind of process really disempowered the industrial working class and really hollowed out a lot of these former industrial regions that we still see today, whether it be Ohio or Pennsylvania, which has now become like Trump country, And at that same time was where we saw the rise of, yes, a service economy, which was based on like extremely low wage, precarious type of work, but also this sort of rise of higher education as this pathway to a sort of a more secure knowledge economy. And that just sort of widened the wider inequality in society as a whole. So you have this problem where the crisis of climate change is caused by our industrial production system, but most people in our society don't have a lot of contact with that system. And the PMC people really just sort of look at industrial production as just the stuff out there that's kind of causing injustice and causing harm, and we just need to stop it. But I think reviving kind of that more sort of old socialist tradition of like actually building up working class power over the industrial production system to transform it, to seize it and transform it is actually what we need to recover, because that's ultimately what the climate crisis is really about. It's about building a bunch of new industrial stuff. And you can, a big wind farm, there's very few things that are more industrial than that, but it's going to have to include a whole host of other things like transmission lines and even things like possibly like nuclear plants. And this industrial infrastructure is what we ultimately need to transform. But we again have experienced sort of decades of disempowering the workers that really do the work in those industrial systems.
So before we wrap, I wanted to pick your brain on the concept of degrowth, right? Where, I sometimes we'll have people write in and say that degrowth politics are the way to go in order to combat climate change. And I am incredibly skeptical of those kinds of arguments because, again, I don't find it feasible, nor do I think it is nor do I think that it fits into the larger class struggle that we want to emphasize here. But what is your opinion on some of those calls and how that fits into the larger climate debate?
Well, the whole problem is if you look up degrowth, if you look up D as a prefix, it means less, it means privation, it means we're going to scale down. And if you look around, about its various definitions of degrowth, it's always centering reduction, less, how to live better with less. It centers downscaling, and ultimately their politics really focuses on this kind of aggregate scaling down of the economy. And I should say, because I get in trouble on these debates, that there's a lot of things they propose that I would agree with. They propose decommodifying social, public services. They propose a shorter work week and things like this that any leftist is going to be behind, But the way in which they frame the debate is always centering less and always centering reduction. And again, for the mass of the working class in countries like the United States, so-called rich countries, they've seen nothing but less for the last several decades. They've seen stagnating wages. They've seen their benefits cut. They've seen the welfare state hollowed out. And so always centering less in a politics of reduction to a working class that is already suffering through austerity is just strategically doesn't make a lot of sense. And a more traditional class struggle approach to politics is to say we need to, you can even say degrow the rich. We need to take from the rich to give more, to give increase to the working class and to the masses, and less for the few and more for the many. So this kind of class struggle is about really taking from the rich to make life for everyone better and more secure. And when you talk about either growth or GDP growth, it's always at the aggregate of society. It's kind of like this aggregate measure that conceals the more divisions and class struggles in society.
Yeah.
And so we really need to have that language of division and conflict between classes. And the one last thing I'll say is they often say, yeah, we get that, and we don't want to degrow the poor countries of the global South, right? We just want to degrow the rich countries, right? But when they even say that, they'll often say we're going to degrow the global North, but this will allow the global South countries to grow. But as I was just suggesting, global North countries are not these aggregate entities. They have huge amounts of poor people and struggling working class people. So saying that we're going to degrow your whole country doesn't help this problem either.
And in terms of those politics, it sounds a little bit too close to austerity politics, and we always know who bears the brunt of austerity politics.
For sure.
All right. Well, Matt Huber, can't thank you enough. Amazing discussion today. Author of Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. Matt will put the link to your book in the podcast description and in the YouTube description and anywhere else that you are listening/watching this program. Thanks so much for your time today, Matt. Really appreciate it. Good to talk to you again.
Really great honor to be on the program. Thanks so much.
Oh, an honor. Wow.